Yeah, I think the election cycle, as I just said, is obviously increasing in relevance because as Brazil is going to be undergoing this fiscal consolidation over multiple years, we obviously want to see whether the next administration stalls the fiscal adjustment or accelerates it or actually puts in a reverse direction. So I think in that sense, these elections are quite important. A couple of thoughts on the election cycle. I think it's way too early to really think about the election cycle and also who might win, as you said, the presidential elections in Brazil. We're still 9 months away. The race is very fragmented. It's very crowded. It might actually become more crowded in the coming days and weeks as more candidates put their hat in the ring. So I think this is going to call for a fairly unpredictable election cycle in the coming months. There is a constructive scenario that a lot of market participants are talking about, is that there would be a centrist candidate that will finally emerge and actually go on to win the elections. But perhaps there are still risks around that scenario because at this point in time, the polls, as we know, the first three candidates that are really high on the polls are not really exactly centrist. And secondly, this race, the rules of the game are changing in the Brazilian election cycle this time around. The election period is very short. And the social media might also play a role. So I think there are other dynamics that we might have to look at. Now, in terms of what we would be focused on, I think generally speaking, when we look at these election races, we should be thinking through the election cycle in the sense that there could be a fair amount of asset price volatility in Brazil going into the elections. We don't think that that's too challenging for the authorities to manage. The central bank has been tested quite a bit before. Reserves position in Brazil remains quite healthy. The FX swap position of the central bank has also come down. And more importantly, inflation is under control. So I think that does give the central bank greater flexibility to deal with these kind of episodes of volatility in the near term. So our focus obviously will remain on what the policy orientation of the next administration will be. And here, again, the Social Security reform becomes relevant because if we don't have a Social Security reform before the election cycle, then the next president almost has to hit the ground running in terms of using the political honeymoon period, if there is one, to pass the Social Security reform. And we would say that the Social Security reform is really the start of the adjustment process rather than the end of the adjustment process. Again, going back to the size of primary deficits of about 2% of GDP, 8% of GDP in nominal deficit, growth alone would not carry Brazil. So there really will be a need for the next administration to show political leadership to go through an adjustment process. And finally, we would also be focused on governability in Brazil. We could, again, have a fairly fragmented Congress. And we would obviously have to see whether the new president can coalesce a coalition to pass these structural reforms.